Brilliant.
All right. So, Jonathan, we're going to put you on now. Everybody, are we ready? We're going to introduce you to Jonathan Pizarro, who's from Gibraltar. He's a writer and also working with a teacher in London. Jonathan, over to you.
Hello, how are you? Good. It's nice to see so many people there. It's really nice. I hope you've been having a very good day. As mentioned, I'm a writer from Gibraltar, and I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about writing, and talk to you a little bit about what you could do in your writing to include things about yourself and your life, and maybe things about Gibraltar or wherever it is that you live as well, especially because sometimes those places, if you read stories or if you watch television and the stories in there, you don't really see places like Gibraltar or other places in those stories. So it's really important to be able to tell your own story. So I was thinking that I would tell you my story. I think that would be a good idea, to tell you a little bit about how I started writing. So I've always been writing. I was writing since I was very young. I always enjoyed it. And I moved away from Gibraltar when I was 18 years old, and I couldn't wait to leave. I thought it was actually very boring to live in Gibraltar. I thought it was very small, and there wasn't a lot to do. I am much older than all of you there, and there wasn't really much internet at the time, and there weren't very many shops, and the cinema, for example, would have films on 6 months after they were on in England, and there weren't very many TV channels, so it all felt very boring, and I really wanted to leave, and I thought that Gibraltar was very boring, and I started studying creative writing in English at university because I really enjoyed writing. But what I wanted to write about when I first went to university was horror stories, and I wanted to write science fiction stories. And I used to write about everything and anything, but not about Gibraltar. I never wrote about Gibraltar. I didn't think it was important. And I didn't think I've seen the look of shock on some of your faces. Yes, I never wrote about Gibraltar. I didn't think anyone wanted to read about Gibraltar. I didn't think anyone wanted to hear about Gibraltar. I didn't think anything I had to say was important about my hometown or about my language or about my culture or about my family. But then one day, I was writing a lot, and my tutor at university, that's like my teacher, used to say to me, these are good, but there's something missing. And I used to submit stories to magazines, and I would never get published. And they would all come back and say to me that these are good stories, but there's something about them I wasn't quite ready for being published yet. And it really frustrated me a lot. And then one day, my tutor said to everyone, he said, why don't you write about home? Why don't you write about your home? So I decided then, I'm like, well, if I have to write about my home, I have to write about Gibraltar. So then I didn't really have a choice. So I thought, okay, I'll write. And I wrote a story that was inspired by my granny, and the calentita that she used to make, and her kitchen, and how I used to spend time in her kitchen. And I wrote a lot in Llanito, so I put in some Gibraltarian words in there, and I submitted it to my tutor, and she said, this is excellent, this is the best thing you've ever written, and I can really feel the story in there. And since then I thought, wow, well, maybe people do actually want to hear about Gibraltar, maybe they are interested in my story. So I started writing all the time about Gibraltar. So I even wrote some horror stories, but I set them in Gibraltar. And then I started submitting to magazines, and I started submitting to competitions, and I started getting published, and they were successful, and that made me really happy. But a lot of what people say to me is that because I shared my story about myself and about where I'm from, that was something that they'd never seen before. So that's something that I want to share with you today, that I think it's very important to sometimes, whatever it is you're writing about, that you bring yourself into it and you bring your own stories. Sometimes that can feel quite boring to you. You might think, well, why does anyone want to hear about me? Why does anyone want to hear about where I'm from? But I think an important thing for you to remember is that whatever you think about yourself, you're the writer and you're not the reader. And actually that reader may have never heard about you. So I think an important thing for you to think about is to think about what kind of writer you want to be and what kind of story you want to tell. And there's nothing better than telling your own story. Even if you're writing fiction, you can tell a lot of stories. So I'm inspired a lot by the stories my grandparents told me. So my grandparents were evacuated to London during World War II, as some of you probably know, because you've learned about it in school. Like a lot of that generation went to London and went to Jamaica and went to Madeira, and they all had very interesting stories there, and they came back with those stories. And my grandparents used to tell me those stories, and I think it's important for me to keep those stories alive as well, because as those older people haven't written them down, I think it's important for them to be put down somewhere and to be able to tell the story of who we are as a people and some of our culture and some of our stories. So things like that really interest me. I'm interested in writing about Gibraltar history, so not just about things like the siege. So you've all done some stories about the siege, but I think it's important to talk about stories about, for example, when the border was closed with Spain for almost 20 years. I think there's a lot of stories there to tell. Stories about when I was growing up in Gibraltar in the 1990s, which seems like a long time ago for you and might be interesting for people to know about, because Gibraltar's changed so much since then. So those are the things that I'm interested in. I'm interested in writing about us as a people, Gibraltarians. I'm interested in writing about using language as well. So I use a lot of Llanito in my stories, and actually some Spanish as well as some English. And sometimes people say to me, well, maybe you want to write just in English. Why are you using so much Gibraltarian language? Why are you using so much Spanish? And it's important to say, well, actually, that's who I am, and it's where I'm from, and it's important to me. So I think those are all very good things and advice that I can give you, which is start to think about what you want to put in your writing and who you want to be and what it is that's unique about you. So think about what's unique about you. What are the stories that you can tell that no one else can tell? So the thing about writing is, and I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're never going to be the best writer in the world. Nobody's ever going to be the best writer in the world. That is a competition that if you're going to try and get into, you're never going to win. But what is important for you to think about is, what can I offer and what story can I tell that's different from everyone else's? What is it about my writing that is going to be different about everyone else's? And when you are talking about yourself and when you're talking about your own story, that's something that's very different to everyone else's, because everyone's life is different. So it might be that you want to write about your family without thinking about them as your family. You can turn it into fiction. You might want to write about where you live. I'm very inspired by thinking about, I go back to Gibraltar a lot and I always walk around and I like the buildings that I see, the old buildings, and imagining maybe who lived there before, or maybe there's a character you're interested in and they might live there, and that starts off an idea for a story. It might be seeing like the sunset go down over Spain and Morocco, and that's really interesting. And then you see a ship that's passing by and you wonder who might live on that ship or where that ship might be going. Those are all really good ideas for you as you're walking around Gibraltar or wherever it is that you live and thinking about stories and ideas for stories. I have some advice for you as well for things you can do as a writer that someone or some people said to me, and I think they might be interesting for you to have as writers. And I wish I'd been given some of this advice earlier. So the most important thing that I ever learned was that writing is not magic. So really, once you finish the story, that can feel quite magic. And when you share it with someone, it's magic. And when you read a book, it's magic. But the actual process of writing is not magic. It's actually work. It's work like everything else is work. So if you think about yourself in school, and when you learn a different language, or when you are writing an English essay, or you're learning mathematics, none of that is magic, is it? You learn to get better at those things by practicing. And it's the same thing with magic. And there's lots of different, it's the same thing with writing. It's not magic. It's something that you need to learn and you need to practice. So there's some things you can do. The biggest thing you can do is read every single day. Read as much as possible. Read things you like and read things you don't like as well, and think about what it is that you don't like about them. And the one thing you can do also is to read like a writer. So you're not just reading for enjoyment, although that's great and you should read for enjoyment, but start to think about, maybe pick up your favorite book and read the first page and think, how does this start? Where does it start? What is the perspective of it? Does it start with someone thinking about something? Does it start with a description of a city or a town or a house? How does the writer describe the house? Can I copy that as well? And that's a really good place to start. You can copy the way other people write, because eventually you'll start writing as yourself. Another good thing you can do is you can keep a notebook. So it might not be that you write every day, but it's good for you to keep a notebook. Some people keep notebooks on their phone. That's okay. I like to have an actual notebook, and you can start to write down your ideas. So it might be that you're not writing a whole story in there, but maybe an idea for a story as you're walking around and your day comes to you, you can write it down so you don't forget. I write sometimes just the first opening line of something, or maybe an idea comes to me of, oh, this would be a good story and I'm not quite sure where it goes, so I write it down. Ideas for titles, that sort of thing as well. And then you might have heard from other people that you need to write every single day. And I don't think that's true. You don't need to write every day. You don't need to put that pressure on yourself, but you should definitely write regularly. You should make sure that you're thinking about writing every day. And it might be that you sometimes write something. So maybe you write in your diary, for example, or you write in your notebook, or then you write a short story one day. It is important to write. And the other important thing for you to do is to also look at your work afterwards. So it's good for you to write. And the best thing you can do is then leave it for a while. Sometimes we can be our own worst enemies when we're writing. So we write a story and we think it's not very good, or we do think it's good, but we can't see it because we've just written it. So it's good to leave it, I would say, if you can, for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then go back to it, and you'll see it differently. You'll see it with different eyes, and you can start to think about it. It's important for you to try and print off your work as well. I know this can sound a bit weird. We live in such a digital world where everything's on a screen, but everything looks really good when it's on a screen. And actually, if you print it out, it means you can read it in a different way, and you can start to look at it, and then you can edit it as you go along, and you start to read it. You can write on that piece of paper. That is really important. And the other one is that a lot of people say that writing is something that is very solitary. It's something that you just do by yourself. But that, I feel, is not true. Writing is something that you can do with other people. And it's important that even if you write and you're by yourself, that you then give that to someone else if you want to. You don't have to. Maybe it is that you just enjoy writing because you like writing, and then you can keep it for yourself. But it's important, if you want to then make your writing better, to let other people read it. So that might be your members of your family, it might be your friends, but it's good to let other people read it as well, that you know are not going to tell you that it's good just because they like you. So try and find someone that you maybe don't necessarily like that much, and give it to them and see what they think about it. Or at least someone that is not your friend, or maybe you find a group of writers that you all want to write together, and you can share that with someone. Because if that person tells you it's good, then you know that's true. And if that person tells you that it needs to be fixed, it's something that you can think about as well. And that's the last bit of advice to give you, that there's nothing wrong with fixing your work. If someone tells you they like your work or they don't like your work, that is their opinion. But it's very important for you to then think about it and go, okay, I can see what they mean. Or maybe you go, actually, I don't see what they mean. I quite like it the way it is. But it's always good to think about your work and what other people say about your work. And don't take it too personally, because everything someone tells you will help you to improve your own work and to become a better writer. And it's through that hard work that you'll be able to be a better writer. It won't happen by magic. So reading, lots of writing, keep a notebook, and then make sure you're editing your work and sharing it with other people as well. And I think that's everything from me, unless anyone has any questions.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure we have questions. Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was
Thank you.
really encouraging advice. And actually, over the last 3 days, we've heard from a variety of wonderful people coming to talk to us. And on Thursday, we heard from a woman called Sylvia Arthur, who is running a big project in West Africa, interviewing women and recording their stories. And I was really interested by what you said about writing about your grandmother and being interested in people. Do you have advice for us in terms of how we approach getting real stories from people and fictionalizing them? Is it something that you think is a route to finding narratives?
Yes, and I think people don't tend to mind. So I think the biggest worry I had when I started writing and was inspired by my family or people I knew was that I was worried that they might be insulted, or that they might not like that I was writing about them. So I think, but I think if you're writing positively about someone, people 100% of the time, I've said to someone, I wrote this story and you inspired some of it. They are always very pleased to see that, because it means they feel recognized in some way. So I would say that if you're being positive about it, then it's okay. But I take stories from everywhere. My own life and my own experiences, things that people have told me, conversations I hear on the street sometimes can start a story. So it might be that you're in a coffee shop and someone's talking to you next door, and they're talking to someone else, and you kind of listen in and make notes in your notebook. So there's all sorts of ways of picking up stories from people you know.
Excellent, thank you. Right, I'm going to throw a question to the floor. Let's have your question. Where are you right now?
Where am I right now? I'm in my house in London. I live in London.
It's a really lovely room. We're all intrigued by everything that's behind you.
There's lots of books, I promise. They're just over here on the sides.
Question.
Why would you think Gibraltar is boring?
Oh.
That is a great question, isn't it? And I feel embarrassed now that I thought Gibraltar was boring. But I think when you are a teenager, sometimes you might think that where you live is boring, because I really wanted to see the world. And I think it was a lot harder to see the world when I was younger, because people didn't travel as much on a plane. I know that sounds really silly because it wasn't that long ago, but actually, like, I didn't get on a plane till I was 16, 17 years old. And it felt very small to me. It felt like I watched television and everything was happening everywhere else. So you're right that Gibraltar is not boring. And I've learned to realize that Gibraltar is not boring, but it's just how I felt at the time when I was a teenager.
And actually, what's lovely about your writing is that you show all the ways that Gibraltar is not boring.
Yes.
you're celebrating the place. I think it's easy to take things for granted. And the lovely thing about being a lovely writer like Jonathan is you can show the detail, and that we don't have to take things for granted. What's your question?
What's your favorite genre of writing?
What's your favorite genre of writing?
That is a difficult question. So I think I like stories about regular people doing extraordinary things. I suppose you could call it literary fiction. So I like doing that a lot. I like reading a lot about just normal people and their lives, because I think they can be very interesting. But I also like a lot of science fiction and fantasy. And I like reading horror as well. I'd say one of my favorite writers is Neil Gaiman, if you've heard of him. So he's written a lot. He writes a lot of fantasy and science fiction stories. And probably my favorite book of his is called Stardust. It was turned into a film as well. And it's about a star that falls to Earth and turns into a woman, and needs to find her way back home. I recommend you read it. It's a very good book.
I like Neil Gaiman as well. I'm very proud to have been his publisher, and I published the Graveyard book.
Oh, fantastic. Yes, another good book.
Very good.
Perhaps, yes.
Okay. Do you read daily or every now and again?
I read every single day. So every single day before I go to bed, I read at least a chapter. I read a lot when I'm on holiday as well, when I have some more time. I'm constantly reading. I've read every day, I think, since I was able to read. And that doesn't mean that it's just books. So you can read magazines, you can read comics as well. But I read every day. Yeah, I don't think there's a day where I don't read.
Great.
How often do you come to
How often do you come to Gibraltar, Jonathan?
Not as much as I would like. I am a teacher, so I can only visit during holidays, but all my family live in Gibraltar. So I tend to visit about 3 or 4 times a year.
Okay, it's quite frequent. I don't want to completely hog the questions, but I have another question.
Of course.
I was interested that you said you've been writing horror stories based in Gibraltar.
Yes.
Or ghost stories. Are they ghosts or horror?
So for my dissertation, which is the big project that you have to do at the end of university, I researched Gothic horror fiction, which is mainly deals with big houses and haunted houses. And I realized that a lot of it had to do with people traveling to the Mediterranean, so more like Italy rather than Gibraltar and Spain, and being scared about some of the culture that was there because they didn't understand it. So what I decided to do was turn that around and actually have horror stories set in Gibraltar. And so some of them were about ghosts, some of them I made up my own monsters and my own creatures. So I set a story in one of the tunnels because I think the tunnels in Gibraltar are quite scary. And I set a story by the lighthouse as well, because I think that area can be quite scary at night, especially when there's a storm. So I wrote lots of different stories. I had another one about the mummy in the Gibraltar Museum coming to life. So I used Gibraltar a lot in my horror stories.
I wonder if you can do a literary tour and take us around and show us the sites of your books.
I would love to.
I'll come. Any other questions? Do we have any other questions for Jonathan? Oh, yes, one more over here. Let's have it.
How old are you?
How old are you?
Much
Good lie.
older than you.
Fair enough, very diplomatic answer. Not old. Okay, well, thank you so much, Jonathan. That was
Thank you very
fascinating.
much.
And I think really delightful for everybody to realise what a wonderful place it is to celebrate in fiction. So thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you.